This occurred in the middle of the COVID pandemic, so public transportation was very often not busy, and I suppose some criminals looked to benefit from that. At midnight one night, I was on my way home alone. As I got on the bus and sat down, I almost immediately registered a man on the other side of where I was sitting who took an interest in me. It was a very clear interest. He fixed his gaze firmly on me almost the entire way. I gradually started to get a little uncomfortable, and a couple of occasions I allowed myself to let my eyes wander across the bus to confirm that I was indeed being watched. I got plenty of confirmation, as he refused to take his eyes off me. Not only did his behavior worry me at this point, but also his appearance in general. He was wearing a large outer jacket with the hood pulled down well over his head, and with clear focus on hiding the lower part of his face with the help of the neck of the jacket. When we got to the point where I must change from bus to subway, he followed. I made a few random small stops here and there to check departures with the intention of watching his movements. As expected, he also stopped. He then followed me down onto the platform, where he clearly stood and watched me from a distance. I was waiting for the train now, and I was beginning to feel the fear that he would follow me all the way to the end station where I would be getting off. First, a different train arrived, a train which I was not taking. I decided to get onto one of the carriages to give the impression that I was going that way, then get off again before the doors closed for departure. I did this both to mislead the man, but also to confirm to myself that he was indeed after me, and it wasn't just me being paranoid. Once again, my suspicions were confirmed. He got into the carriage, but then he turned around and saw that I had gotten off again, and he also got off and stood back on the platform. Now the anxiety really started to kick in. Finally, my train arrived, and I stood a bit waiting before I got on, then strategically slipped on the second the doors closed. He did the same. I then sat down in the front seat of the front carriage with my back to the cab to make sure that he had no opportunity to move behind me, as I sat with a full view of the entire carriage. Unsurprisingly, he walked towards me and sat in the seats directly in front of me, leaned back with his arm resting over the back of the seats, and fixed his gaze on me. I felt my heart pounding away, and that my breathing was getting harder to keep in check. Nevertheless, I tried my best to appear unaffected by it all, as I didn't want him to see that I was scared. But at the same time, it was becoming more and more challenging for me to keep a cool head and think clearly. A little beyond us sat another slightly younger guy. I hoped that the other younger guy would stay on the train with us to my stop, which was the last one. My plan was that if I didn't have to get off alone, that I could ask to be accompanied home by the younger man. There were now only 3 of us left on the track, and what I feared most at that point happened. The other guy was starting to get ready to get off at the next stop, which was 2 stops before mine. Now the adrenaline really kicked in, and I realized that I should act fast, as I had no idea what the man's intentions were. I did not want to be alone on the train with him. It ended with me sitting completely still in my seat, then jumping up and sprinting out of the carriage onto the station just as the doors closed. Taking a quick glance behind me as I ran away, I saw that the man was also in a hurry to get off, but luckily he didn't have time to before the train moved on. From there, I ran the whole distance home in fear of meeting him on the way, as there are short distances between the last 2 stops. Here, obviously, the adrenaline did me a big favor since my fitness these days were not great. I luckily made it home safely and quickly agreed with myself that I would never again go out alone on the evening during COVID at least, and likely on other nights as well. This happened on a November evening in 2016. I was at the Munich airport where I had a layover going to Milan where I live. There should have only been a half-hour layover, but my flight got more and more delayed. I realized that it would be past midnight before I got home now. When I finally arrived in Milan, I considered whether to take a bus or a taxi since it was late. But I ended up taking the bus because a taxi would be much more expensive and it was a short bus ride. Fortunately, I lived centrally in the city and not alone, but it was about 1 a.m. and my roommates would be asleep for sure. When I got to the central station, I went to the bus stop where the city bus runs. My place was only 2 stops away, and I thought that it would be safer than walking all the way home. There was a sketchy gang at the bus stop, but I went there anyways and waited for the bus. I've done this at nighttime in other places before, and every other time it had gone well. The bus arrived and I got on. I felt very alone as a woman, because there were mostly just other men who sat quietly and didn't say anything. There were only 2 other women on the bus, but they seemed drunk or to be on drugs. After a short trip that felt long, I could finally get off. I chose not to have music in my ears for the walk so that I could hear if somebody was following me. I had only a light bag with me, so walking was easy. It took about 5 minutes to walk to the apartment. The streets were unusually quiet. Usually there's foot traffic, but now there was not a single car or person to be seen. It was completely quiet, and all the traffic lights were on green. I crossed the road, followed the street straight down, and turned left where my apartment was. I reached the front door that leads into the common hall. The door is always locked, so only those who have keys to the apartments on the block can enter. I hadn't heard a single sound except for small raindrops and my own footsteps, but still, I turned my head to the left as I was about to unlock the outer door and saw exactly what I was afraid of. A man came walking. I never heard his footsteps. He had a normal walking speed, but the fact that he was walking like that made me uncomfortable. I put the keys in and unlocked the door. The man, who I hoped was only passing by, lined up behind me and was ready to enter. Him not saying anything made me even more uncomfortable. I tried to ask if he lived there, just to get him to say something, but he didn't answer. I didn't dare refuse him entry or say anything further, because I was scared that he would become violent or that he might live in the apartment and had forgotten his keys and it was a coincidence. We both went inside, and I quickly walked towards the stairs and acted natural. The stairs go up to the right, and I turned my head discreetly to the right before going up. The man was still standing at the entrance, and he closed the exit door slowly behind him as if he didn't want anybody to hear. I went up the stairs as fast as I could up to the second floor where I lived. The lock on the door that I was going to unlock from my apartment was a bit tricky, and typically enough it must be twisted around for a bit. I tried to insert the key silently so that he wouldn't hear where I was. When I put the key in the door, I was quiet, listening to hear if there were footsteps from the man down there, but I heard nothing. I creeped over to the railing and looked down, and there he was, still on the bottom floor. He looked up at me, and he was suddenly smiling now, pointing at me, and then he started slowly walking while holding my gaze. Of course, I got even more scared, and I jiggled with the lock at the door, but I couldn't get it open. I took a break from trying to work on my lock and called one of my roommates, but there was no answer. I could see the man now heading towards me. I kept standing there, and I managed to hide that I was scared. He got near me and just stood there and then looked at me. I managed to get out a hello in English just to get him to talk, but again, he didn't answer. He just stood there looking at me like he was waiting for me to open the door. The key was in the door, and I finally managed to open it. Thank goodness my friend must have heard or seen that I had called her phone, or maybe heard me struggling with the lock. She was right on the other side of the door once I unlocked it, about to open it for me. I believe that the man suddenly realized that I did not live alone, and then he walked away from our door back down the stairs. I sent a text to my employer about the man, who also owned the flat that we lived in, and she told me to contact the police. I began to think about if maybe that man was a murderer, and he could be out in the hallway waiting for possibly a victim, and I would feel really guilty for letting him into the building. It took 30 minutes before the police arrived. The man was gone when they got there. He was nowhere to be seen in the building, and we never saw him again. I honestly don't know what the man wanted. Maybe he was just a homeless person who wanted a place to sleep. After all, he didn't do anything to me. But if this had been a murderer or something like that, it would have been easy for him to overpower me into my apartment once I opened the door if I lived alone. Nobody would have heard or seen me, so I'm glad that my roommate had come to the door, because maybe he would have tried something if he hadn't seen her there. This happened when I was in my first year of college. I was 18 and I took the city bus to and from school every day. I felt very safe on the bus because it was a line for the college in my town, so it was pretty much mostly ridden by college students. After the bus, I had about a 10-minute walk from my stop to my house. One afternoon, I got out of class and rode the bus home. I got off at my stop and walked my normal route home. I had just gotten onto the street I lived on when a man in a new-looking black truck pulled up next to me. The man was white, chunky, and probably in his late 20s or early 30s. He rolled down his window and asked me where something was. I had my headphones on, and even though I could still kind of hear his question, I pulled them out and asked him to repeat the question. He then asked me where something else was, and not whatever previous location he had said before I pulled out my earbuds. I thought it was weird, but the longer we talked, the more I realized he was not genuinely asking for directions. He then started asking me, what is there to do in this city? I'm new here. To which I told him I don't know and there really isn't much to do. I told him there's a mall and that's about it. I kept walking while we had this conversation and he drove slowly next to me. We were getting closer and closer to my house and I was getting uncomfortable. I tried texting my dad that there was some guy talking to me and I was feeling weird, but I noticed that my dad's truck wasn't in the driveway so he wouldn't be much help. The man then asked me if there was a movie theater at the mall, and I said yes. He asked me what movies I liked, and I said I didn't watch movies. He then asked me what TV shows I liked, and I said I didn't watch TV. Both of those statements were false, but I was trying to shut him down. He then asked what I did for fun, and I said I was a student. I tried to hint at the idea that I might still be in high school to see if the possibility of me being young might deter him, but he still pursued. He offered to take me on a date to go see a movie. By this point, we were way past my house. I obviously didn't want him knowing where I lived. He offered to come and pick me up the following Saturday, and I said no, just flat no. He then tried to tell me that I was really pretty and asked if I had a boyfriend. I said no, I was a student, and that I didn't have time for a boyfriend or to date. I once again tried hard to imply that I might still be in high school to try to protect myself, assuming he wasn't a total pedophile who wasn't afraid to date underage girls. He finally got the hint about me being in high school and said, "Really, I thought I saw you getting off the college bus. All right then, have a good day." Clearly, he had been following me since I got off the bus. I had been walking almost 10 minutes by that point. Honestly, he could have even followed me from my college 30 minutes away, since my bus is a city bus of course, and its main stop was just the college. Anyone can get on that bus, and unless you're familiar with the bus lines, you wouldn't know that the bus is ridden by college students. I circled around the block to make sure that he wasn't still on my tail before I went home. I told my dad about it, and we drove around the block to see if it was somebody living in our neighborhood. Thankfully, his black truck wasn't parked at any of the neighbors' houses. I didn't have any other choice but to continue riding the bus to and from school every day, and thankfully I never saw that man again. Last November, my brother was visiting us from Dundee in the UK with his 3-year-old son. Since my brother had moved away, we didn't get to see him or his family very often, so we cherished it any time we could see them. His wife unfortunately could not travel due to work, and only a day into his visit, he was called back himself for an emergency. His son, my nephew, wanted to stay as we bought him tickets to the football match the day after, so I agreed to take him back to his dad in Dundee after the game. The only train I could get was a late one, and it was therefore the last one of the day. So I took my nephew to the football match and headed straight for the station afterwards. The train was busy, but I had booked us 2 seats for the long train ride. Just as we were about to board the train, the man standing next to me made an odd comment. He said something about packing them in like sardines and how he hates sardines. I found this fairly odd, but I just laughed it off awkwardly. I've never been good at making conversations with strangers, and I always feel uneasy when they approach me. As we made our way to our seats, I noticed an old couple sitting in them. I told them these were our seats, but they were rude and told me that old people shouldn't be made to stand for a journey. I always hate confrontation, especially in public, so I just left. There were no 2 seats together anywhere on the train, so my nephew and I were forced to stand for about an hour until many people in the back finally got off when it stopped in Perth. My nephew and I sat down, and I mistakenly fell asleep as I was so tired after the long day and standing for an hour on the train. As my nephew was only 3 years old, he obviously fell asleep as well. I awoke just as the last passengers were getting off at Dundee. I quickly jumped up and tried to get my nephew off the train as quickly as possible, but he was too slow and I had to stay on the train with him, meaning we missed the stop. As the train was delayed slightly, it was now going straight to Aberdeen, which was about another hour or so away. I sat down and tried my phone to anyone I knew, but I didn't have a signal. I began to panic, as I know there would be no return trains from Aberdeen at this time of night, likely meaning I would have to stay the night there in a hotel. I tried to compose myself, and I looked about the train to see if there was anybody who could maybe help me. My carriage had cleared out by this point, and there was only 3 other people left. An older woman sleeping a few rows in front of me, a young man reading a book at the opposite side, and a 3rd man behind me. I told my nephew to go back to sleep, and started trying to plan what I would do when we got to Aberdeen. As my phone had no signal, this was obviously going to be difficult, and I thought I should ask the man behind me for any help. I looked in the window's reflection at him, and noticed he was the same man who made the sardine comment earlier. He was a middle-aged man, average build and height, and there was nothing that would suggest he was in any way dangerous. Except one thing, he was staring right at me. I looked away for a minute, thinking maybe he was just looking about the train as I did only a moment ago, but when I looked again, he was still staring. His stare didn't seem to break until he got up to presumably go to the toilet. I debated switching to another carriage, but before I could gather my stuff and wake my nephew, he returned. Only this time he sat in a different seat facing me directly. A few uneasy minutes went by before he made his first comment, He said, "Someone's sleepy," and nodded towards my nephew. I laughed awkwardly and put my earphones in to avoid having to talk to him, even though my phone had just died. The sardines man said, "Must be some set of earphones if they can listen to music when your phone's dead." My heart dropped. He continued and said, "I'm only kidding you on," but I now had no excuse to avoid a conversation with him. He asked if I was going home or visiting someone, and I made the mistake of telling him what happened and that I had missed my stop. He responded by saying, "That's quite the situation. You won't get a train back at this time." I nodded and said I would just find a hotel for the night. He then approached my seat and sat across from me. He said, "Hotels will all be booked out, and even if they aren't, they'll charge you a fortune." He continued and said, "I've got a place not too far from the station. You can stay there for the night and get the train in the morning, and don't worry, I'll stay out of the way of you and your son." I explained to the man he was not my son, and that I was happy to spend the money for a hotel. I said this while also trying to stay polite by saying I didn't want to be a nuisance for him, even though I was just not going to stay at a stranger's place. The man responded in an overly friendly tone with, "Oh, believe me, you won't be any nuisance to me." I was now feeling extremely unnerved, but tried my best to talk myself out of the situation. The conversation carried on for another 10 minutes or so, and he was increasingly insistent that I stayed with him. I didn't have any idea what to do. I felt completely helpless. I told him that I needed to use the toilet as an effort to get away from the carriage. That was when he grabbed my wrist below the table. "You're not going anywhere," he said in a hushed tone. "You're staying with me. I'll keep you safe," he said in an extremely chilling voice. I couldn't even bring myself to scream out in that situation. The only other passengers on the carriage were at the opposite end, and I was terrified that if I screamed, the man might hurt me or my nephew. He wouldn't let go of my wrist and repeatedly told me to just act natural. The remaining part of the journey seemed to last a lifetime, and it seemed like there was no light at the end of this tunnel, as this man would not let me go. The train finally reached Aberdeen, and the man told me to wake my nephew without alarming him, and to tell him that we were staying at this nice man's house for the evening. He held my hand as we got off the train, and my worst feelings were coming true, as I knew what would happen when this man got us back to the house. All of a sudden, I was knocked to the floor in a heap of bodies. The police had tackled the man and were arresting him. As I got to my feet, I grabbed my nephew's hand and ran a couple of yards away before completely breaking down. The police comforted me and told me that the young man who was reading his book at the other end of the carriage noticed what was going on. During the train ride, he had sent a text to the British Transport Police, whose number is all over the walls of the train on posters. It took me a couple of minutes to process everything, but I managed to gain enough composure to thank the police and express my gratitude towards the man who sent the text. I only managed to say a few words to him, but I will be forever grateful. He saved me from what would have been a night of terror, and possibly saved me and my nephew's life. The police very kindly took my nephew and I back to Dundee, where my brother and his wife were extremely relieved to see us. It's been some time since that incident now, but I vowed to myself to never fall asleep on the train again, and that I will never miss my stop again. A few years ago, about 2019, I was riding the bus one night to get home. There was a guy on the bus that was a little disheveled and dirty looking. He reeked of alcohol and was generally acting weird. I was sitting in the back and he sat near me and tried to talk to me. I was polite at first. I ride the bus at night a lot, so a drunk homeless guy does not bother me, and I have no problem making small talk with a stranger on the bus. Plus, I'm used to there being one or two sketchy people on the bus considering the route and the fact that it's late at night. When he tried to get flirty, I politely told him that I was not interested, and I put my headphones back in my ears and ignored him. He got a little frustrated and even said some vulgar things, but I couldn't really hear him, so it was fine. It wasn't my first rodeo being in that kind of a situation, and while it's uncomfortable and there's nothing okay about that sort of behavior, I rarely feel threatened. Most of the time, they're harmless, all bark and no bite. I'm a big girl, as in tall and overweight, and I know basic self-defense and always have an exit strategy when there are scenarios I don't feel safe in. Many people like that on the bus I find most of the time. Ignoring them and acting like I'm not fazed is enough for them to get bored and find something else to do. I only engage if they get in my face or start harassing other passengers, especially other women, kids, and seniors, or anyone who appears vulnerable, because I won't tolerate that. Also, the bus drivers usually don't put up with that either. Anyways, this random drunk homeless guy would have been just one of the many if it wasn't for what happened next. So my stop was coming up and I was looking forward to going home. I was exhausted and so ready to go to bed. I pulled the cord to indicate that I wanted off at the next stop, and the man got up and walked to the front to talk to the driver and then laughed loudly. I didn't think much of it, except I was a little wary and thought, please don't tell me we're getting off at the same stop. As the bus slowed down, I was waiting at the back door to be let off. Instead of opening the back door, though, the driver opened the front door and the drunk guy got off. I asked the driver to open the back door, and I saw him shake his head in the mirror. Annoyed, I walked to the front of the bus to get off there, but the driver closed the door before I could get off and started driving again. Angrily, I told the driver, "Hey, that was my stop." The driver replied, "Sorry, but I can't in good conscience let you off at the same stop as that guy. Either get off at the next stop, or wait until we get to a transit station and take a bus going the other way." Not understanding, I asked why. The driver said, "Because of what he said to me." I asked what the drunk homeless guy had said, and the driver just said, "Nothing I would like to repeat ever. I'm so sorry, but just trust me." The driver looked shaken, considering the tone of his voice and the look on his face. As frustrated and anxious as I was to get home, I trusted him and took his word for it. I caught another bus going the other way at the next terminal, and watched the driver radio dispatch and get some peace officers and transit security to patrol the area near my stop. They were parked in the parking lot near my building when I finally got off. I was extremely paranoid and on high alert as I walked the few blocks to my apartment that night, fortunately without further incident. I never saw that guy again, and I'm okay with that. To this day, I wonder what exactly he said to the driver. It bugs me not knowing, but at the same time, maybe it's better that way. Either way, the implications were enough to have freaked me out.